I recall after I got saved, it was such a new experience for me in being in that romantic stage with Jesus where I was reading his words and learning about him. And you know I wouldn't say before I was saved that I was completely horrible. I mean, I like the rest of the world. I followed the way the rest of the world did things, the way they thought, uh, what they did. But I was just carried off in the thinking of the world, and just trying to be a good person. I could honestly say, I mean, that's such a overused cliche. Trying to be a good person. It reminds me of all these you know some Christian movies that are just have really bad acting in them and all that. And somebody talking about them trying to be a good person. So that's kind of cliched out. But I in my mind, I was I was thinking that I wasn't as horrible as a murderer or a rapist or anything like that. So I thought I was fine. And I thought that once I died, I was going to go to heaven. And everyone had that thinking apparently, and everyone does have that thinking. You know, People justify themselves saying, "Well, I'm not as bad as this person, or I'm not as bad as that." But once I got saved, it was a whole new experience. It was like I was really starting to live. And I can honestly understand the term, what Jesus said, that about being born again. And I was born again. I was given a second chance at life. Because before I was saved, a broken relationship, led me into almost wanting to commit suicide. And, I just couldn't handle the pain of the breakup anymore. Here I was investing so much of my heart to this person, and they just, you know, apparently didn't feel the same. So it's pretty sad just how the world thinks that you base your life on an individual person, and that person not caring about you the way you feel about them. So yeah, I was going to commit suicide because of that broken relationship. But once I got saved and I was reading Jesus' words, it was like I couldn't get enough of them. I had to keep reading, and I went to church, and just starting to experience God like I had never had. I mean, I'm not saying that, there's a lot of Christians out there that feel his presence. They get waves of whatever, and they manifest physically to the spirit touching them. But I've never felt that. The only thing I've ever felt was goosebumps. So I don't base my close relationship with God to any kind of experience physically. There's a lot of people out there that apparently do. I mean, I heard this one teacher that, challenged her and said, "I'm going to take my presence away and you're not going to feel me for like a year," because God wanted to strengthen her by faith. So it's complete opposite for me, is that I trust God by faith that he's with me, because his word says, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." So it's very important that, yeah, we don't base our faith on what we feel from God, but on who he is and what he has said. So, like I said, after I got saved, I was, experiencing, you know, just the pure joy that I never had of, you know, learning about God and I was telling everybody about him. And just so you know, I'm leading into what I'm going to be speaking about, and I feel all this has to be said before I do, so that I have a foundation down of what I'm talking about. But so leading into that, first experiencing God, I didn't hear his voice a lot. I mean, I remember one time where I was reading the Word, and I happened to look up, and I saw this man laying out on the lawn, you know, across the way, and I felt a prompting, like, to get up and go out to him. So I did. And I guess that prompting itself was God's voice of saying, go out to him. So I did that. So if I did hear God, I really don't remember. It was years ago, back in 98, 99, 2000, when I would hear spurts of his voice or whatever. But it wasn't a constant, consistent thing. And I never thought that God could speak to me in that way because I never heard it. The church that I got saved at and the Bible college, they never even spoke, as far as I know, about hearing God's voice. So until I got to the church, a new church that I went to, a non-denominational, in like 2001, 2002, that's where they were teaching. They were talking about hearing God's voice and following, what he was saying. So I started learning about how to really hear God's voice. And from that, I started journaling what I believed he was saying to me. So in my own experience, in my faith walk and hearing God, I've learned that there are three voices that a believer hears. And the first one is his flesh, his desires, what he wants to do. And the second is Satan's, the enemy. He'll speak, when we're angry with somebody, or he'll talk about unforgiveness. And, I'll get back into this, a little more detail in a minute. And then the third voice is basically God's. He speaks of comfort and things to come. So in my experience, those are the three voices that I've learned that we can hear. So depending on the circumstances, you can entertain two of the voices, and it's yours, the flesh's, and it's the enemy's. Now, when the circumstances are bad, that's when the enemy speaks. He tempts us to be unforgiving and to hate somebody. And if we make agreement with that, then, it's going to appeal to our flesh and what we want to do. And if we decide to walk by the flesh, we're not going to want to follow Jesus' words when he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Because according to this world, the world hates anybody that they are in a disagreement with. They're not about working it out. They're all about hating their enemies. So we can also hear in our desires what we want to do. When God speaks to us, he speaks comfort, he speaks instruction, encouragement, and future things about what's to come. Now, the enemy tells us to continue on in our selfishness, to hate, and he wants discord between the body, and he tells us not to forgive. And when you're having a really bad day, that's when he really speaks up and tries to get you to walk in the flesh and to make agreement with him. And like I said, whatever he says, it appeals to our flesh. But we can choose either to listen to him or not to listen to him. Now, when, hearing these different voices and hearing God, we really need to have integrity. Why am I saying that? Well, in my experience, I've heard of a lot of believers that have, they hear what they want to hear. They hear from their flesh and they decide to go with it, and they claim that it's God. And that's basically the purpose and reason for this video, is to come against that. Now, in my experience, when I was journaling, I I would hear what I believed to be God's voice, and the enemies. I mean, it sounds the same in my head, so it takes, learning to decipher between them. So I have to wonder personally how many times I have wrote my desires down instead of God's words. And you may be asking, if you're new to this, that how can you do that? How can you tell the difference between your voice and God's? And it's really to pinpoint his voice. It takes spending time with him in prayer and learning to listen to him. The more you listen to him, the more you're going to become acquainted with his voice. It's like if you were to sit in a chair with a blindfold on, and somebody brought a random person to you that you know, but you can't see, and that person started speaking, you would be able to decipher their voices, whether it's your mom, your best friend, your wife, your girlfriend, whoever it may be. You can decipher their voice. So in the same way, and this is revelation that God just gave me while I'm speaking. So in the same way, the more we spend time with God, we can decipher his voice. I mean, sometimes we can possibly write down our desires, and it sounds so much like God. So I would say give it time, and let time, show it for what it is. It said in the Old Testament, Moses told the people that you will know a false prophet because if what they are saying that I have not commanded them, if what they say doesn't come to pass, you have dealt with a false prophet. So in the same way, I'm not going to call anybody a false prophet, but I will just say, if you're hearing God's voice or not, then you need to write down what he is saying, or whatever you're hearing, and let time be, let time bring about if it's true or not. But this whole topic of people that, go with their desires and what they want to do, and they falsely claim that it's God telling them to do that. I've heard of, circumstances with people in the past where, they had a reason for leaving the church, and they claimed that it was God. So, God knows the truth of whether or not it was unforgiveness that led them into making that decision and not working anything out, or if it was God's instructions. But I recall one person that, just upped and left, and they were claiming that it was God that was telling them. And one of my friends was like, "No, it's not God." And my friend was very direct. He's a very direct person. So really, anybody out there that is claiming that God's telling them to do this and they're walking in the flesh, only they know personally whether or not that they have integrity in hearing God's voice. And of course, we're all, in a process with God. So God's got to show them, you know, the thinking that's folly. He's got to show them that they need to have integrity when hearing him, and not falsely claim that it's his voice when it's not. So integrity is a big thing when hearing God's voice. And, hearing God's voice is such a gift, that God resides in us, and he cares about us enough to guide us and to comfort us, you know, And it's such a big thing, and we should never ever take it for granted. And I already spoke of that. 1 second. Sorry about that. So if anybody that is claiming that it's God, but really it's their flesh, they have to go through their decisions. And, just how wrong their decisions were. And they have to repent for saying that it's God when it's not. So if we have it rough, it's most likely because the enemy had tempted our flesh, and because he tempted our flesh, we make agreement with that and decide to go the way we want to go, according to our flesh, and not what God would want. God may tell us that I want you, to not save for, whatever it may be. But in our flesh, we want to save because we want a certain thing. So we can choose whether or not to obey God or, to obey our desires. So when we obey our desires and something negative happens from that circumstance, then God shows us, well, I had given you my instructions, but you didn't heed them. So this is a learning experience for you. And God's not going to withdraw us out of that negative circumstance. We have to go through it so we can learn. It's like Job when he was running away from God's calling. Not Job, Jonah. He was running away from God's calling. And, he wanted Jonah to preach to the Ninevites. But he didn't want to do that. So he had to go through what he went through just to show, that you have to obey the Lord. Now, there is a difference in being new to hearing God's voice and then having experience and doing it your way anyway. And, that's a big thing. If somebody's new to hearing God's voice, they're going to naturally, most likely go with their desires and say it's God. And God has to bring them through, learning to hear his voice correctly. But somebody that is out there that is experienced in hearing God's voice, they should know better, because if they're experienced in hearing his voice, then they can pinpoint what he's saying. But in their flesh, they want to hear what they want to hear. They're writing down, or they're going by their desires. So really, they're accountable for purposely mishearing God's voice. And like I said, somebody that's new into hearing God's voice, they're naturally going to get confused with which voice that they're hearing. So, when we're hearing God's voice, we know it's him because he speaks comfort, encouragement, about somebody that, it could be encouragement and comfort for somebody else. For us, he could speak about things to come for somebody else or for us. So that's how we more or less can hear and know what God's voice is. And what the enemy's voice is. And then your desires is what you want to do. So it reminds me about Jeremiah 28 and the false prophet Hananiah, where he said that in 2 years' time, God was going to break the yoke of Babylon off Israel. And so God commanded Jeremiah to speak to Hananiah and said, you got the people to trust in a lie. By this time next year, you're going to be dead. And so Hananiah died. So even in that, we should have the fear of the Lord, in hearing his voice and being guided the right way and guiding other people the right way instead of by their desires. And Hananiah spoke and got people to trust in a lie that God never even sent him. And he was speaking his desires and what he wanted instead of what God had actually said. Now, something that should really concern us when we're hearing God's voice is the world is watching. If you're open to telling people what God is telling you, and you're mishearing him purposely and going by your desires and telling the world, God's told me to do this or God's told me to do that, the world is watching that. The world is seeing exactly what somebody is doing that is not right. So if you mishear him purposely and going through a hard time, people that of the world that hear you say that watch you go through what you're going through, and they're going to be like, I don't want to go through that. I don't want to have to deal with that. Why should I come to God? So, we need to watch how we are in front of the world, and we have to walk in integrity. And like I already said, if you're new to God, it takes time to pinpoint his voice and recognize it. So I'm going to end it here because I basically spoke about everything that I needed to speak about. And I spoke about earlier what was at the conclusion of what I wrote. So basically, this is I guess you would say, a further teaching on hearing God's voice. And basically, if you're learning to hear his voice, you want to have integrity. You want to really be humble and it takes being humble and not prideful. And a lot of people can fall into that trap saying, well, I can hear from God. And, they wear it like a medal around their neck, showing off to people. And there is not an inch of humility in them. And humility is required. That's what I was told. That is, before you ever attempt to speak a word from God to somebody, that you have to have love in place. There should never even be hate or any ounce of the flesh before you hear God's voice, because you're going to be writing down exactly what it is from your flesh. You're going to be writing down your words and not God's. And so how much damage are that person going to do to somebody? So I'm going to end it here. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and God bless you.